Thank you for joining me tonight. Find a comfortable spot, let your shoulders relax, and allow the day to gently fade away. There is nothing left for you to do but rest. Tonight, we are turning to the pages of Fyodor Dostoevsky. I know what you might be thinking. Dostoevsky, the famous Russian novelist known for his cheerful, light-hearted comedies. Well, perhaps not. His stories often wander through the darker, more complicated corners of the human mind. But within that journey, there is a strange and profound kind of peace to be found. A quiet understanding that it is okay to be human, with all our beautiful and messy contradictions. So tonight, we are not going to wrestle with any grand, intricate novels. Instead, we are going to explore one of his most hopeful and unusual tales, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. It is a story about letting go of the world's noise and finding a simple truth in a dream. There is no need to follow every word. Just let my voice be a gentle guide as you drift off. Let the story unfold as you settle into a deep and peaceful sleep. All right, let us begin. Our story tonight is about a man who lived in the heart of a great and gloomy city. And this man had come to a very simple and profound conclusion about himself. He was a ridiculous man. This wasn't a new or painful discovery for him. In fact, it was a quiet truth he had lived with for as long as he could remember. He had a feeling he was simply born that way. Even as a small boy, playing in the schoolyard, he could sense a strange distance between himself and the other children. They moved with a kind of effortless certainty, their games and their arguments following a logic he could never quite grasp. He always felt as though he were standing on the outside, watching them through an invisible pane of glass. When he tried to join in, his words would come out just a little bit sideways. His earnest questions were often met with giggles, his serious observations with puzzled looks. It was as if everyone else in the world had been given a rulebook at birth, and his copy had been lost in the post. So, over time, he learned that the easiest path was one of quiet observation. And in that silence, the feeling deepened and settled into his bones. The world was one way, and he was another. He was, in a word, ridiculous. He carried this feeling with him to university, hoping that perhaps in the world of ideas, in the quiet hush of libraries and lecture halls, he might finally find a place where he made sense. He threw himself into his studies with a kind of desperate hunger. He read the great philosophers who sought to map the landscapes of the human soul. He studied the scientists who measured the cosmos and broke the world down into its smallest atoms. He learned of history, that grand and repeating story of ambition and hope and folly. He filled his head with so much knowledge that there was hardly any room left for himself. But a very strange thing began to happen. The more he learned, the more ridiculous the world itself began to seem. He saw the great patterns of history and watched the people around him repeat the very same mistakes with a passionate sincerity. He read the elegant logic of the philosophers and then saw how life was lived according to the most beautifully illogical impulses. The world, which he had hoped would cure him of his strangeness, instead seemed to confirm it on a grand scale. His own personal ridiculousness now felt like a tiny drop in a vast and absurd ocean. And as this understanding grew, the shame he had carried for so long began to fade. It was replaced by something far larger and far quieter. A deep and unshakable indifference settled over his soul. It was a slow, creeping frost. One day, he noticed that the food he was eating had no taste. A little while later, he found that a piece of music that once moved him to tears now passed through him without leaving a trace. Arguments, celebrations, tragedies, comedies, they all began to flatten out, becoming the same gray color in his mind. They were just events, happening somewhere far away, as meaningless as the dance of dust in a sunbeam. This emptiness grew until it filled him completely. And then, one evening a few months ago, as he was walking through the damp, gaslit streets, a final and simple truth revealed itself to him. It wasn't a complex idea. It was as solid and as plain as a stone in his hand. The truth was this: nothing mattered. It had never mattered, and it never would. The stars in the sky and the cobblestones under his feet were all part of the same grand, cosmic shrug. This realization did not make him sad. In its own way, it was a profound relief. It was the final answer to every question he'd ever had. If nothing mattered, then his own lifelong feeling of being ridiculous was of no consequence at all. He was, at last, completely free. And in that quiet freedom, he made a very calm and logical decision. He decided his life was no longer necessary. It was not an act of passion or despair. It was simply a matter of tidying up. The story was over, and it was time to close the book. So he went to a shop and purchased a small, well-made revolver. He brought it back to his quiet room, with its single window and its comfortable, worn armchair. He loaded the weapon and placed it on the little table beside the chair. He decided he would wait for the right kind of night, a night that felt as empty and as silent as his own heart. And that brings us to the moment our story truly begins. On a cold and starless November night, with a soft rain whispering against the window pane, there he sat, in the old armchair that knew his shape so well. The revolver lay on the table, cool and patient. His mind was perfectly calm. The long, strange, ridiculous story of his life had brought him to this one quiet, final moment. And he was ready. But just as he was about to reach for it, something held him back. A thought, a feeling he had not expected. A small but persistent question that began with the memory of a little girl he had seen on the street just a few hours before. Before he settled into his chair for the last time, he had been out walking. The night was a deep and heavy black, the kind that seems to swallow all sound. A fine, cold mist hung in the air, blurring the edges of the gas lamps that cast long, watery reflections on the slick, black cobblestones. He walked without any particular destination in mind, feeling the damp chill seep into his coat. He was not really seeing the city. The tall, sleeping buildings, the dark and empty windows that looked like vacant eyes, they were all just a backdrop, a passing scenery on his quiet, final journey. He was moving through the world, but he was no longer a part of it. His decision had wrapped him in a cocoon of silence and detachment. The distant rumble of a carriage, the faint sound of a closing door somewhere down a lonely alley. These were noises from another reality, one he had already left behind. He was on his way home to his armchair, and to the small, elegant revolver that was waiting for him. It was then, as he turned a corner onto a particularly dark and narrow street, that something happened. From the deep shadows of a doorway, a small figure suddenly emerged, stumbling into his path. It was a little girl, no older than 8. She was soaked through by the rain, her thin dress clinging to her small frame. Her hair was matted to her face, and she was shivering not just from the cold, but from a desperate and powerful fear. Before he could even register what was happening, she ran to him. Her small, cold hand suddenly gripped the sleeve of his coat with surprising strength. She was crying, not loudly, but with a series of ragged, choked sobs that shook her entire body. She looked up at him, her face pale in the faint, distant gaslight, and her voice came out as a thin, desperate cry. She was saying something about her mother, that her mother was in trouble, that she was very sick, that something terrible was happening. For the first time in a very long time, the man felt a flicker of something. It was not pity, not yet. It was annoyance, a small, sharp irritation at this sudden, messy intrusion into his calm, orderly departure from the world. He looked down at the child, at her terrified, pleading eyes, and the great truth he had discovered just hours before echoed in his mind. Nothing matters. If the entire universe was a meaningless void, then the fate of this one small, shivering child on a wet street corner in St. Petersburg certainly did not matter. Her sorrow was just a tiny, temporary ripple in an ocean of nothingness. And so, he did what his philosophy demanded. He pulled his arm away from her grasp. He did not say a word. He simply stamped his foot on the wet stone of the pavement with a short, sharp sound of impatience. The girl let out a small, startled cry and let go of his coat. She watched as he turned his back on her and simply walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. He did not look back. He did not wonder what would become of her or her mother. He simply continued his journey home, the cocoon of his indifference wrapping around him once more. He walked up the dark, winding stairs to his apartment, unlocked his door, and entered the quiet stillness of his room. The encounter was over. It was forgotten, or so he thought. He entered his room and closed the door, shutting out the damp night and the city and the memory of the little girl. The silence inside was immediate and familiar. It was his sanctuary, the one place in the world where his profound emptiness felt at home. The single candle he lit cast a soft, flickering glow, making the shadows in the corners of the room dance like quiet thoughts. He walked over to his old armchair, the worn velvet a comforting presence beneath his hand. And there, on the small table beside it, lay the revolver. It sat there, patient and still, its dark metal absorbing the faint candlelight. It looked so simple, a small object designed for a single, simple purpose. He felt no fear looking at it. The calm resolution he had carried with him all evening was still there, a cool, smooth stone in the pit of his stomach. He sat down in the chair, the old springs groaning softly, a sound as familiar to him as his own breathing. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness of the room settle over him. This was it, the final act in his quiet, ridiculous play. The rain whispered its soft, steady rhythm against the window pane, a gentle, lulling sound. The moment was perfect. He reached his hand out, his fingers hovering just above the cool metal of the revolver. And then he stopped. His hand froze in midair. For in the deep silence of his mind, a question had begun to form. It was a small and seemingly insignificant question, but it was there, and it would not leave. Why did he feel that pang? When he had turned his back on the little girl, when he had stamped his foot in irritation, a strange feeling had pricked at him. He had ignored it then, but now, in the absolute stillness of his room, it returned. It was a dull ache in his chest, a faint but undeniable sense of pity, and closely behind it, a shadow of shame. This was, to his logical mind, completely unacceptable. It was a flaw in his great equation. If nothing in the universe mattered, if his own existence was a zero and the existence of everyone else was also a zero, then the suffering of a small child on a wet street corner should be the most meaningless thing of all. Her tears should have been no different to him than the raindrops falling on the pavement. His choice to walk away should have felt as neutral as choosing to turn left instead of right on a meaningless journey. And yet, it did not. He lowered his hand and rested it on his knee. He looked at the revolver again. The simple, mechanical act of picking it up now seemed impossibly complicated. The memory of the girl stood between him and the gun. He could see her face, pale and streaked with rain, her eyes wide with a terror that was so real, so absolute. He could almost feel the phantom grip of her small, cold hand on his sleeve. He argued with himself, his thoughts moving in slow, weary circles. It's just a biological reflex, he told himself. A leftover instinct from a time when he believed things had meaning. It was a ghost sensation, nothing more. But the feeling would not be dismissed. It was not a ghost. It was real. It was a weight. And if he felt pity for her, then her pain had a value. It mattered, even if only to him. And if her pain mattered, then what else mattered? Where did it stop? If he were to act on this feeling of pity, would he then be obliged to feel other things? To find joy in a sunrise, or sorrow in a sad song? If he let this one, tiny exception into his perfect philosophy of nothingness, the entire structure would collapse. The beautiful, liberating peace of the void would be shattered by this one, illogical feeling. An hour passed, then another. He did not move from the chair. The candle burned lower, its flame casting long, dancing shadows. The rain continued its soft, relentless drumming on the glass. He sat there, a prisoner of this single, nagging contradiction. The world he had so carefully dismantled and dismissed had found a way back in, not through a grand argument or a profound revelation, but in the form of a small, shivering child he had met for only a moment. The sheer exhaustion of this internal battle began to weigh on him. His mind, which had been so clear and calm, was now a turbulent sea of confusion. The simple path forward was now blocked by an obstacle he could not reason away. He was too tired to fight it anymore. His eyelids grew heavy. The revolver on the table seemed to be miles away, part of another world. He leaned his head against the soft, worn velvet of the armchair, and without meaning to, without deciding to, he simply let go. The quiet room, the flickering candle, and the weight of his impossible question all began to dissolve as he drifted away, not into the final silence he had planned, but into the deep and welcoming darkness of sleep. As he slept in his armchair, a profound shift occurred. The solid world of his small, candlelit room, with its familiar shadows and the soft sound of rain, began to dissolve. It did not fade or twist into strange shapes as dreams often do. Rather, it thinned out, becoming as insubstantial as smoke, and in its place, another reality, just as solid and real, took form. In this new reality, he found himself standing. The revolver, which had been resting on the table, was now in his hand. Its weight felt familiar, correct. The nagging question about the little girl, the question that had anchored him to his waking life and its messy contradictions, was simply gone. All that remained was the calm, clear logic of his decision. In the dream, he raised the weapon to his chest, to his heart, and with a sound that was not a loud crack but a dull, final thud, a sound that seemed to be absorbed by the silence around it, everything ended. There was no pain, no sudden shock, just a quiet and immediate severance from the world. He felt as if a switch had been thrown, and his consciousness, which had been a small, flickering light, was instantly extinguished. For a time, there was nothing, a perfect and complete void. But then, slowly, a new kind of awareness began to seep back in. It was a consciousness stripped of all its usual tools. He had no body, no eyes to see, no ears to hear, no nerves to feel. Yet he could perceive his state with an unshakable certainty. He was lying in a closed box, a coffin, and he knew that he was buried deep beneath the heavy, damp earth. The darkness was unlike any he had ever known. It was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical presence, a thick, velvet substance that pressed in from all sides, filling his non-existent eyes. The silence was just as profound, a heavy blanket that muffled even the idea of sound. He felt no panic, no fear, no desire to escape. His state was absolute. He simply existed, a point of pure awareness in a box of wood, waiting. He had no way to measure the time that passed. It could have been minutes, or it could have been millennia. The entire concept of time seemed to have been buried with him. At some point in that endless stillness, a single event occurred. A drop of water, having worked its way down through the fathoms of soil and through a tiny flaw in the coffin's lid, landed on his closed, unfeeling eyelid. He perceived its coldness, a single, sharp point of sensation in an eternity of nothing. A long while later, another drop fell in the exact same spot, and then another. This slow, impossibly patient rhythm was the only clock he had, the only thing that punctuated the immense, silent void of his existence. He began to wait for each drop, his entire consciousness focused on that one tiny, recurring event. And then, just as he was settling into this timeless rhythm, everything changed once more. He felt a deep and powerful resonance, a shudder that passed not just through his coffin, but through the very fabric of his awareness. The oppressive silence was broken by a low, grating sound that came from everywhere at once, and his grave was opened. He did not see it happen, but he felt the immense pressure of the earth above him suddenly vanish. He was seized by some vast, unseen force, a presence both dark and powerful. It was not a violent grasp, but an inexorable pull. He was lifted, and he felt himself rising, not through an open hole in the ground, but directly through the solid earth itself. The layers of soil and clay parted before him like water. He passed through tangled networks of ancient roots, past sleeping stones, and the forgotten remnants of things long since buried. It was a silent, ghostly ascent, until he finally broke through the surface of the world and was hanging in the cold, thin air of the night. The journey was only just beginning. The mysterious presence that held him continued to carry him upward, away from the sleeping city, which now looked like a scattered handful of faint, golden embers below. He rose past the dark, heavy bellies of the rain clouds he had walked under just hours before, and ascended into the clear, sharp cold of the upper atmosphere. The great blue curve of the earth became visible, its edges softened by a thin, glowing halo. With an impossible, silent speed, he was pulled away from his home. The planet shrank from a vast world into a beautiful, swirling marble of blue and white, then to a bright jewel, and finally, to just another star in the infinite, glittering darkness. He was being carried through the cosmos. They flew past the moon, so close that he could see the profound stillness of its gray, dusty plains and the sharp, black shadows in its craters. The stars, which had always been fixed points of light in the sky, began to move. They streaked past him, first as slow lines of silver, then faster and faster until he was flying through a tunnel of pure, brilliant light. Great, cosmic clouds of gas, magnificent nebulae in shades of deep violet and incandescent gold, drifted by like sleeping gods. He was a silent witness to the birth of suns and the slow, graceful dance of distant galaxies, a tiny speck of consciousness on a grand and purposeful tour of creation. The man was carried through the infinite darkness for what felt like an eternity. The universe unfolded around him in a silent, majestic display of creation, a spectacle so grand it erased any sense of his own small, forgotten life. He was no longer the ridiculous man from St. Petersburg. He was a disembodied witness, a mere point of consciousness adrift in the cosmic ocean. He passed through rivers of starlight and by sleeping galaxies that spun in a slow, graceful dance that took 1 billion years to complete. The cold of the void was absolute, a perfect and profound emptiness that seemed to be the true nature of all things. He felt no longing for the warmth of life he had left behind. He was at peace in this great, silent emptiness. Then, after an immeasurable time spent in this stellar river, he noticed a change in the view ahead. Out of all the countless stars that glittered in the velvet blackness, one began to grow. It distinguished itself from the others, its light warmer, more golden, more familiar. As they drew closer, this single point of light grew into a blazing, benevolent sun. He recognized it with a certainty that went beyond thought. It was our sun, the very same star that had warmed his face on the rare sunny days in his gray city. And as he recognized the sun, he saw something else, a tiny speck of blue and green circling it in a familiar orbit. His mysterious guide carried him directly toward this world. As they approached, his dream heart, an organ he did not physically possess but could feel with perfect clarity, began to ache with a strange and powerful emotion. It was a feeling of homecoming, but a homecoming to a place he had never known. He saw the continents and the oceans taking shape, a perfect replica of the Earth he had so recently left behind. It was the same planet, with the same land masses, the same swirling patterns of white clouds, the same deep, majestic blue of the seas. And yet, it was profoundly different. This Earth shone with a vibrant, inner light. It was unblemished, pure, and perfect. It was the earth as it was meant to be, an earth that had never known sorrow or failure, or the deep weariness that had settled into the very soil of his own world. They descended through the atmosphere of this second earth. The air was not just air, it was a substance so clean and sweet that to breathe it felt like drinking from a spring of pure life. He saw lush, green forests that stretched for miles, their trees reaching up to the sky not in a struggle for light, but in a gesture of joyful praise. He saw rivers that ran like veins of liquid silver through the land, their waters so clear he could see the smooth, colorful stones on the riverbed from miles above. There were no sprawling, smoky cities, no lands scarred by industry or conflict, no sign of the decay that had touched every part of the world he knew. This was a world still in its first, glorious morning, a paradise that had never been lost. His journey ended as gently as it had begun. He was set down, not with a jolt, but with the softness of a falling leaf, onto a carpet of emerald green grass beside a grove of beautiful, flowering trees. The warmth of the sun on his dream skin was a gentle, caressing blessing. The air was filled with the sweet scent of unknown blossoms and the rich, clean smell of fertile earth. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and the sound was not just a sound. It was a kind of quiet, happy music. He stood there, a visitor from a sad and broken star, and looked out upon a world that was singing a quiet, joyful song of its own existence. He had arrived. He stood there for a long time, simply breathing in the sweet, life-giving air of this new earth. The sunlight was a gentle, liquid gold, warming him not just on the surface, but in the very core of his being. The world hummed with a quiet, joyful energy he had never known. The songs of the birds were not just random calls. They were intricate and beautiful melodies that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of the breeze. He walked into the grove of trees, and as he placed his hand on the smooth, warm bark of one, he felt a strange and undeniable sense of a living, welcoming presence. Everything here was alive, and everything was happy to be so. Soon, he was no longer alone. They came out of the woods and from over the gentle, rolling hills, not with suspicion or alarm, but with a simple, open curiosity. They were people, men and women, but they were unlike any people he had ever seen. They were beautiful, but it was not the sharp, self-aware beauty of his world. It was a radiant, effortless grace, the kind that comes from a heart that has never known a single moment of envy or anger or fear. They were naked and unashamed, their bodies moving with a fluid and natural elegance. But it was their eyes that held him. Their eyes were clear and bright, shining with an unconditional love and a deep, peaceful wisdom. They were like children, but children who held the knowledge of the stars in their gentle gaze. They gathered around him, and there was no fear in their approach. They smiled, and their smiles were not polite gestures. They were pure expressions of joy at his presence. One of them reached out and gently touched his cheek, and he felt a warmth spread through him that was more profound than the sunlight. It was a touch of pure, uncomplicated love and acceptance. He, the man who had felt ridiculous and out of place his entire life, was being welcomed without a single question. They spoke to him, and while he did not understand their language with his mind, his heart understood it perfectly. Their voices were like music, and every note conveyed the same simple message. You are welcome here. We love you. He began to live among them, and he saw that their entire existence was built upon this foundation of love. They had no laws, because there was no desire to harm or to take. They had no temples or churches, because the entire world was their sacred space, and every living thing was a manifestation of the divine. They lived in harmony with nature in a way he could barely comprehend. He would watch them speak to the animals, not as masters, but as friends, and the animals would respond in kind. The trees seemed to bend their branches to offer them fruit. and the rivers seemed to sing a happier song as they swam in the clear, cool water. They did not strive for knowledge as his world did. They did not have science or philosophy books. They did not need them. They possessed a deeper, more direct kind of wisdom, an intuitive understanding of the universe that came from the heart, not the head. They felt the truth of their connection to each other and to all of life, so they had no need to prove it with logic. Their happiness was not a fleeting, frantic thing. It was a deep, calm, and constant state of being. They knew no suffering, but they understood a kind of gentle, contemplative melancholy that allowed them to appreciate their joy all the more. Their love was not the possessive, jealous love he was used to. It was a boundless, flowing river that they all shared. Children belonged to everyone, and every adult was a parent to every child. Their lives were a continuous song of praise for the gift of existence. And as he lived among them, the man felt the hard, cynical shell he had built around himself for decades begin to crack and fall away. The weight of his own ridiculousness, the burden of his indifference, all of it was washed away in the pure, healing light of their love. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be home. For a long time, the man lived in this state of blissful peace. He loved these gentle, radiant people with a purity he had never known was possible, and they loved him in return. The deep, weary wrinkles of his soul, carved by a lifetime of irony and indifference, were smoothed away by the constant, gentle sunlight of their affection. He forgot his old life, his old self, and the gray, meaningless world he had come from. He was happy, but because he was a man from our world, a son of St. Petersburg, he carried within him, deep and dormant, the seeds of a different way of being. And without ever meaning to, without a single shred of malice in his heart, he began to sow them. It all started so very small, so innocently that it was barely noticeable. It began as a game. In his old world, life was a complex dance of hidden meanings, of playful deceptions and little white lies. It was a way of being interesting, of creating intrigue. One day, in a moment of playful affection, he taught one of them a small, harmless lie. He showed them how to pretend, how to joke and tease in a way that had a shadow of untruth in it. To him, it was just a game, a bit of harmless fun. It was the way people flirted and played where he came from. He never imagined it could be anything more than a fleeting moment of amusement. But this single, tiny atom of falsehood, once introduced into their world of absolute truth, was like a drop of potent dye in a glass of clear, pure water. It spread. The people found this new sensation interesting. The idea of saying something that was not perfectly, transparently true was a novelty, a sweet and intriguing puzzle. They began to play with it themselves. This playfulness led to the first taste of vanity, the pleasure of having a secret thought that others did not know. And from that small, sweet pleasure, the first crack appeared in their perfect unity. For the first time, one of them had a feeling that was exclusively their own. Once the idea of a secret self was born, other, darker things soon followed. The feeling of separation gave rise to the concept of mine. My thoughts, my feelings, my favorite tree, my place by the river. And once the word mine existed, its terrible shadow, yours, was not far behind. With this division came the first pang of jealousy they had ever known. Then came the first argument, a shocking and ugly sound in a world that had only ever known harmony. Shame followed, and the need to defend one's honor. They began to form groups, to separate into smaller tribes, each with its own secrets and its own sense of pride. The beautiful, flowing river of their shared existence had been shattered into 1,000 separate, selfish puddles. The man watched all of this unfold with a growing, silent terror. He saw what he had done. He was the carrier of a plague, and he had infected paradise. He ran among them, pleading, trying to remind them of how things were before. He tried to explain the beauty of their lost innocence, the perfection of their unity. But it was too late. They could no longer understand him. They had tasted the fruit of a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge of the self, and they could not untaste it. Some of them would look at him with a strange new expression in their eyes, a look of cunning and suspicion. He, who had been their beloved guest, was now a strange and unsettling reminder of a past they were already beginning to forget. He had brought his broken world with him, and he had used it to shatter theirs. The seeds of discord, once planted, grew with a frightening speed, their roots digging deep into the fertile soil of this once perfect world. The sweet and simple game of pretend had given way to the hard and bitter work of true deception. The people, who had once known only the truth, now learned the art of hiding their thoughts and intentions from one another. Their clear, shining eyes, which had once been open windows to their souls, now grew guarded and watchful. Their unity, once a seamless ocean of shared existence, had become a collection of separate, warring islands. They learned to value what was theirs over what was everyone's, and soon they began to build walls and fences, not just around their gardens, but around their hearts. He watched in horror as they began to replace their deep, effortless feeling of truth with a complicated and frantic search for knowledge. Because they could no longer feel their connection to the universe, they began to study it. They built great projects to measure the stars and analyze the soil, desperately trying to understand with their minds what they had once known perfectly with their souls. They created philosophies, intricate and clever systems of thought designed to define concepts like justice, virtue, and happiness, things they had once simply lived without ever needing a word for them. They began to argue over these definitions, each person and each group convinced that their own fragment of the truth was the whole truth. They had traded wisdom for information, and the exchange had left them poor indeed. With this new, fractured understanding of life came the need for rules. They created laws to manage the conflicts that now arose daily. They appointed judges to punish those who broke the laws, and soon they built prisons to house the lawbreakers. They invented the concept of shame and honor, and they fought terrible battles to defend these new, imaginary treasures. They also began to worship. Having lost their direct connection to the divine spirit that lived in all things, they tried to recapture it in rituals and dogmas. They built beautiful stone temples, but these temples were monuments to a lost connection, not a celebration of a living one. They prayed to gods they imagined lived in the sky, because they could no longer feel the divine presence that was right there in the earth beneath their feet and the air they breathed. Their world, which had once been a paradise, was now a perfect mirror of the flawed and sorrowful earth he had left behind. They learned about hard labor, for the earth no longer gave its gifts freely to them. They learned of sickness and grief, for their hearts, now closed off from the healing flow of universal love, grew heavy with sorrow. They toiled and they struggled, always seeking a happiness that now seemed to be just over the horizon, a prize to be won through effort and strife, rather than a simple state of being to be enjoyed. The man who had caused all this walked among them like a ghost. He was the only one who remembered how things had been. He tried to speak of it, but they no longer understood his words. To them, he was a madman, a fool who spoke of an impossible, childish dream. He, who had brought them the complexity of sorrow, was now mocked for speaking of the simplicity of joy. The man's existence in this fallen paradise became a form of silent, walking torment. The sorrow he felt was no longer his own private burden. It was reflected back at him from every corner of their new, complicated world. He saw it in the way they now averted their eyes from one another, where they had once shared open, loving gazes. He heard it in the strained and careful tones of their voices, where there had once been only the music of effortless harmony. Every fence they built, every lock they forged, every tear a child shed in a moment of selfish frustration felt like a personal accusation. He was the ghost at their feast of consequences, the one who remembered the taste of the perfect meal they had forgotten. His guilt was not a simple thought or a fleeting emotion. It was the very air he breathed, the ground beneath his feet. It was a poison he himself had administered, and now he was forced to watch its slow, agonizing effects on a world he had come to love more than his own life. He could not bear it any longer. To simply watch, to be a passive observer of the ruin he had caused, was a punishment too great. A desperate, blazing idea began to form in the depths of his despair. It was an idea born of the world he came from, a world that understood sacrifice and atonement. He reasoned that if his presence, his actions, his very being had been the catalyst for their fall, then perhaps his suffering, his ultimate negation, could be the catalyst for their restoration. He would offer himself as the antidote. He would absorb all the pain he had created back into himself, and in a final, terrible act, remove it from their world. He resolved to make a sacrifice of himself, hoping that the sight of his suffering might shock their souls back into the memory of their lost innocence. He found them gathered in a large, open meadow where they had once danced in perfect, joyful union. Now, they were in smaller groups, talking in low, serious tones, their faces etched with the new and unfamiliar lines of worry and suspicion. He walked into the center of them, and a hush fell as they turned to look at this strange, sorrowful man who had been the beginning of their troubles. He stood before them, his body trembling not with fear, but with the immense weight of his love and his guilt. He stretched out his arms to them, a gesture of complete and total surrender. His voice, when he began to speak, was choked with tears, a raw and broken sound. He told them everything. He confessed that he was the serpent in their garden, the one who had whispered the first lie. He claimed responsibility for every argument, every pang of jealousy, every moment of loneliness they now endured. He begged them to take all their newfound anger and pain and focus it upon him, the rightful target. He pleaded with them, his voice rising in desperate passion, to make him suffer. He described the visions from his own world, of redemption through sacrifice. "Build a cross," he cried, the words tearing from his throat, "and nail me to it. Let my pain be a lesson. Let my ending be your new beginning." He offered himself to them as a vessel for their rage, hoping that in the shared act of his destruction, they might find a new and terrible kind of unity, a unity that might, by some miracle, remind them of the beautiful one they had lost. He finished his plea and stood there, his arms outstretched, his body a living testament to his guilt, waiting for their righteous fury to descend upon him. But there was no fury. There was no anger. The people looked at him, and then at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and a strange, gentle concern. A murmur went through the crowd, not of rage, but of discussion. Then, one of them smiled. It was not the radiant, open smile he remembered. It was a small, sad, knowing smile, the kind an adult gives a child who is overwrought by a nightmare. Soon, others began to smile in the same way. A soft, pitying laughter began to ripple through the crowd. It was not the cruel laughter of a mob, but something far worse, the weary, condescending amusement of a people who believed they were dealing with a harmless madman. They shook their heads and spoke to one another. He heard them say that he was clearly unwell, that his sorrow had unbalanced his mind. They saw his grand, cosmic guilt not as a terrible truth, but as a symptom of a personal illness. Some suggested that he should be taken away, cared for somewhere quiet where he could not disturb others with his passionate and nonsensical stories. His monumental offer of sacrifice, the most profound and painful act he could conceive, was being dismissed as a charming eccentricity, a theatrical outburst. The horror of it washed over him. It was not their hatred he had earned, but their pity. His great sin was not even real enough for them to punish. The pain of this ultimate invalidation, the sheer, crushing weight of being so completely misunderstood by the very world he had ruined, was a sorrow too immense for the dream to contain. It was a pain that shattered the illusion, a silent scream that ripped through the fabric of his sleep. And in that instant of absolute psychic agony, his eyes flew open. He gasped, taking in a sharp breath, and found himself staring into the familiar, shadowed darkness of his own quiet room. The sound of the rain a steady, indifferent whisper at the window. He was awake. He sat there in his armchair, the profound and vivid reality of the dream still clinging to him like a warm blanket. The tears that had woken him were still wet on his cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of an overwhelming, ecstatic joy. He was weeping for the beauty of the people he had met, for the pain of their fall, and for the simple, staggering gift of being alive. The gray, familiar reality of his room, which hours before had been a tomb of indifference, now seemed vibrant and sacred. Every shadow, every speck of dust dancing in the faint light of the approaching dawn was a miracle. His eyes fell upon the revolver, still sitting on the small table. It looked like a relic from another lifetime, a strange and ugly artifact belonging to a man who no longer existed. The cold, hard logic that it represented, the philosophy of nothingness, the calm resolution of the void, now seemed like the most ridiculous idea he had ever encountered. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and pushed it away, sliding it to the far side of the table where it was half hidden in shadow. He had no desire to throw it or destroy it. It simply had no power over him anymore. It was an irrelevant object, a tool for a job he no longer wished to do. He had seen the truth. He did not need to study it or write a treatise about it. He had felt it. The truth was so simple, it was almost laughable. It was that people could be happy and beautiful without losing their ability to live on this earth. He knew now that the paradise he had visited was not an impossible fantasy in a distant solar system. It was a possibility, right here, waiting to be unlocked within the human heart. The key was simple: to love others as you love yourself. That was everything. Everything. If people would only embrace that one single law of being, the world would transform into a garden in an instant. He stood up from the chair and walked to the window, pushing it open to the cool, damp morning air. The rain had stopped, and the sky was a soft, pearly gray. The city was beginning to stir, its first quiet sounds rising from the courtyards below. He knew what he had to do. He would walk among people, and he would preach. He would tell them of what he had seen. He would tell them of their own forgotten beauty and of the paradise that lay sleeping within them. He knew, with a calm certainty, that they would laugh at him. They would call him a madman, a fool, a ridiculous man. But it no longer mattered. The sting of that word was gone forever. Let them call him what they wished. He was filled with a purpose so vast and so loving that it left no room for shame. His life was no longer a meaningless story to be ended. It was a mission that was just beginning, and he knew exactly where to start. He would go out, and he would find that little girl. And so, our story comes to a close. The ridiculous man, who began his night in a place of profound emptiness, awakens to a world filled with meaning. He found his purpose not in a grand philosophical text, but in a strange and beautiful dream. A dream that reminded him of a simple truth we often forget: that life, in all its imperfection, is a precious thing, and that a little bit of love is the most powerful force in the universe. There is nothing more for you to think about now, nothing to solve or to understand. Let the story go. Let its meaning settle somewhere deep and quiet within you, like a smooth stone at the bottom of a peaceful lake. The night is here for you to rest. Allow your body to feel heavy and comfortable. Allow your mind to be still. Let my voice fade away, and let the gentle silence guide you now into a deep and truly peaceful sleep. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.